Could you take us through the sort of the differences between the Russians and the Europeans, and how the Russians might be able to leverage that in a way?
I mean, realistically, Russia's main targets, or at least its main planning, has gone into strategic nuclear exchanges with the United States.
Right.
In a lower intensity, perhaps what they call a regional conflict or a regional war, there's obviously NATO targets.
One of the most shocking developments that I've seen has been in some of the dialogues that I've been in with European colleagues recently. For a long time, there has been interest among European colleagues, of course, in nuclear arms control between the United States and Russia. If there would be, a war between NATO and Russia, Europe is likely to be the battlefield and where a lot of the nuclear weapons would be used. And we have this current problem where the New START treaty, which expires next year, the only nuclear arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, is currently suspended. And President Trump has said that he would be interested in potentially reducing the U.S. arsenal, possibly up to by half.
This is The Global Gambit.
How are you going? So last week, Emmanuel Macron, president of France, made some seismic comments stating that potentially France could be open to the idea of providing a nuclear umbrella to the whole of Europe in replace for the United States because, well, let's be frank, transatlantic relations are not exactly going swimmingly, and it is the Atlantic Ocean after all. So, quips aside, I did a primer on the severity of that situation, a sort of overview of what it might mean, how it would work, and more. But the significance of that, on top of everything else that we're seeing economically, culturally, politically, diplomatically, it deserves a deeper dive. And I couldn't think of a better couple of people to talk about this than those who we've had on the show before. Dr. Nicole Grajewski, who's a fellow in the nuclear policy program at the Carnegie Endowment for International Peace, and Dr. Stephen Herzog, who is a professor of the practice at James Martin Center for Non-Proliferation Studies. And they've both had strong affiliations with Harvard and its Belfer Center as well. But guys, it's lovely to have you back. We did this a couple of years ago, I think, just as an audio, but now you're on the show, get to see your faces and talk about nuclear stuff. So thank you very much for joining.
Wonderful to see you in person.
Yeah,
well, in person, right, on the internet.
In better circumstances. But I normally I like to do a couple of warm-up questions, but I think the significance of what we're seeing now with these conversations even being had, are we seeing a reversal in the attitudes towards nuclear weapons and that more countries are going to start getting them? I don't know, Nicole, if you want to start off.
Well, Stephen does work on population surveys and population kind of public opinion towards nuclear weapons. I don't know if you want to start, Stephen.
Well, I'd be happy to start, and then, you can fill in. And what I would say is that we have seen since the beginning of Russia's full-scale invasion of Ukraine in February 2022, some changes that we would not have expected to see as far as nuclear weapons. One change, for example, which I think is immediate, is Sweden and Finland, which had historically been neutral for so long, joining NATO, an explicitly nuclear alliance to be covered by the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Polls in Germany shortly after Russia's invasion of Ukraine showed that for essentially the first time ever, a majority of the German public was interested in having U.S. tactical nuclear weapons remain on their soil. It was 52% were represented in the polls. Polls and surveys since then have shown that the Polish public, for pretty much the first time ever, has become interested in potentially having an indigenous nuclear capability, despite the fact that they are protected by the U.S. nuclear umbrella. Now, public surveys are one thing, government policy is another thing. And this entire time, the German government, the Polish government, and other governments have essentially stood steadfast with their ally, the United States. The alarming comments from the Trump administration that they will, A, seem unlikely to continue aid to Ukraine, and B, that they may no longer be interested or willing to protect NATO allies that don't contribute their fair share of defense spending, combined with the cancellation of future U.S. military exercises in Europe, I think has triggered some pretty massive shifts. And so we now see Macron talking about the potential provision of a French nuclear umbrella to Europe, which is something that people have talked about in past years. It's been seen to not be credible, but now it may be more credible from before. And the recent comment by Polish politicians, both President Duda and Prime Minister Tusk, suggest shifts in Polish public opinion alongside the raising of an army of 500,000 troops, mandatory military training for all essentially eligible and fit Polish males. The Polish government is now talking about the potential of European nuclear capabilities and even flirting with the potential talk of getting its own. So I would say, some of the early lessons that we've talked about before with the war in Ukraine is, will it contribute to more deterrence or more disarmament? And I think that answer regarding the war in Ukraine, and given the Trump administrations, is becoming pretty unequivocally clear. We are seeing a lot of interest in nuclear weapons, whether a European capability or even potentially indigenous nuclear proliferation in Europe that we haven't seen.
Yeah, I'll just add kind of the context in which this is occurring. I mean, I don't think you would see these statements or the increase of salience in nuclear weapons had it not been for Russia's persistent nuclear saber rattling throughout the war in Ukraine. I mean, Russia has largely provoked a lot of this kind of backlash in essence, or at least interest in nuclear weapons. And Russia's used its possession of a sizable nuclear arsenal as a way of dissuading either aid or support to Ukraine throughout the war, and also signaling to Western countries about their policies towards Ukraine, trying to dissuading them from supporting Ukraine. Of course, Russia, by all intents and purposes, Russia's nuclear arsenal is much larger than both the British and the French combined on the European continent. And Russia has a far more diverse capability. But in general, I think that we see a lot of this reaction occurring because of Russia's efforts to lower its nuclear doctrines threshold, its non-strategic nuclear weapons exercises with Belarus, and its deployment of non-strategic nuclear weapons in Belarus under Russian custody.
Yeah, I mean, I want to come to the Russian element and your particular expertise a little bit later, Nicole, but sort of from just a numbers perspective, the French and the British operate on that minimum or minimal deterrence sort of doctrine, whilst the Russians have a more of a escalate to de-escalate kind of approach. Is it a simple case, therefore, that we're going to have to see, well, if this nuclear umbrella were to gain more traction, would the British and French have to get more warheads as a way to sort of, I don't know, counterbalance, or like they can do enough with what they have? Because a lot of people are saying sort of to me on my comments on my other video that sort of like 500 between the two is sufficient, but sometimes in an optic sense it's not enough, and that's why we're seeing China try to get more warheads now, right? Some estimations I think said the Chinese could have 1,000 warheads by the end of the decade. I don't know if that makes sense, but like what are we learning from that perspective?
I mean, not to war game too much or kind of come up with hypothetical situations, but the French and the British deterrent is not as diverse. They don't have land-based silos like the Russians. And then on top of that is like their nuclear arsenal and also their nuclear doctrines are really tailored to the context of their vital national interests, and are not really created or structured in a way that could be for extended deterrence or conducive to that. And to even increase the size of their nuclear arsenals, that's going to involve a laborious effort, and it also will take quite a bit of years to pursue that. So there's a lot of questions on the table when it comes to actually having the force structure to do so, and whether they're actually willing to extend deterrence to non-nuclear states akin to the way the US does with NATO.
Right.
So I would add to that, I think there's two contexts here. I think there's a technical context and there's a political context. So let's immediately focus on kind of the technical context before we think about the political context and would they be willing to do it or not. So the French have 290 nuclear warheads, if you believe the most recent open source estimates by the Federation of American Scientists. The Brits have 225. Unclear whether they could have a collaborative nuclear deterrent capability or not. But I think that there are two important points here that need to be raised. One is the diversity point that Nicole mentioned. And one way that the United States has made its nuclear umbrella credible is with the deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe. Now, these are these forward deployed nuclear weapons that are in Germany, Turkey, Italy, the Netherlands, Belgium used to be in countries previously, and they have some relatively low nuclear yields. So they have variable yields, sometimes in the sub-kiloton range, and are believed to be able to be more usable because they can be used on the battlefield. Hence, they're believed to contribute to deterrence. So Russia has a ton of these, has a massive amount, estimated to be about 2,000. The United States is estimated to have between 100 and 150 in Europe. The French and the British do not have tactical nuclear weapons and have not made this investment. So as Nicole said, the French and British nuclear deterrents are geared towards strategic targets. They number in the hundreds of kilotons. So by comparison, the Hiroshima and Nagasaki bombs are estimated to be between 14 and 22 kilotons. So the French and British deterrents are strategic weapons designed to protect the strategic interests of Britain and France. The use of these weapons would have to be most likely against Russian cities or large military targets, which means that there's a question about credibility, and could these be credibly used or threatened? Now, the other point that I would make too that I think is important is because the United States has such a large arsenal, in the event that Russia were seen to be potentially going to war with NATO, the United States has the capabilities to try and launch a counterforce strike against the Russian arsenal to limit the damage that would happen in Europe. France and Britain don't have the numbers in order to be able to do this. So there are serious questions about, as Nicole mentioned, about the orientation technically of these forces for conducting a deterrence mission for it.
All right. And so sticking with you, Nicole, how exactly should all of this be interpreted given what's happening with the transatlantic relationship and NATO? Trump's comments about it, the constant perception that he might withdraw from it or severely defund it. How does that all play out vis-a-vis Franco-British security assurances, nuclear umbrella, and the NATO alliance's relevance?
I think you just see this general trend of increasing European strategic autonomy, or at least a desire to go in that direction. And obviously, the NATO has been a way for the United States to kind of entrench itself in European politics and in the security of Europe for decades. And so this shift, in a sense, is kind of delegating more responsibility to a lot of these European countries for their own security. And so I think that's a trend that you're seeing, but this shouldn't be a surprise. I mean, the first Trump administration saw this trend already occurring with many of its statements and policies towards NATO. So this didn't appear out of nowhere. I mean, this has been a longstanding approach to the region from the United States. And so I think that the European governments were anticipating this, but the kind of transatlantic division right now is increasingly acute. And so you do see these all occurring in that kind of context of the deterioration there, and also Europe's drive for more strategic autonomy.
Yeah, what I was going to say is, building on what Nicole said, the comment by the Trump administration that Europe is, quote, not paying its fair share on defense, I think from a pure numerical perspective seems to be true for a lot of policymakers. But I think that one of the things that's often missed is that there was a concerted strategy during the Cold War and for many decades for the United States to foster dependence upon its defense economy and forces for Europe. And there were many ways that this served a good role for the United States. It boosted the United States defense industry. It served a non-proliferation role in Europe, and it got loyal allies who would vote with U.S. interest in the UN General Assembly and the United Nations Security Council. So personally, coming from the American perspective, I do believe that there were several U.S. administrations that did have opportunities to kind of slowly rebalance and recalibrate the relationship with many European allies. And so maybe there were some missed opportunities there. But what the Trump administration has done here is essentially been, shock therapy on some level. And I think it has so far not been productive. And one of the things is that the European relationship with the United States has, of course, as I mentioned, served a non-proliferation function. And I think that if the United States packs up and goes home, I don't want to say that the United States is doing that, and I think there's a lot of fear that they're doing that. I think there's a lot of fear now, and people are acting as if the U.S. nuclear umbrella no longer exists, which is not the case. But if there are changes, there may be cracks in that non-proliferation function.
Well, I was going to ask you a little bit about that, because the NPT has obviously been a defining driver of so many countries' relationships or non-existent relations to nuclear weapons, right? Canada's, I think it's even part of their actual constitution or whatever, that they don't get their own nuclear weapons. And therefore they would probably seek some kind of, protection from the Franco-British nuclear umbrella, hypothetical, right? So I don't know, Stephen, what are we seeing when it comes to sort of countries' attitudes towards the NPT, could the whole thing just dissipate and collapse, or is still enough of a support for non-proliferation that it will hold?
So I think, people have been pronouncing that the NPT has been dead ever since it opened for signature. So the NPT opens for signature in 1968, and critics have been saying the NPT is dying. We'll see vast cascades of proliferation. And this, for the most part, has not materialized. We have 9 nuclear armed states now. We had a 10th with South Africa having developed the bomb and dismantled. But what is worrisome right now is statements by leaders, like the leaders in Poland, talking about considering the nuclear option. We've also seen the South Korean president in the past do this. And so the question is would these states actually do it or not? And Articles 1 and 2 of the NPT prohibit the transfer of nuclear arms from nuclear weapon states to non-nuclear weapon states. And they prohibit the acquisition of nuclear arms by non-nuclear weapon states, which all of these countries in Europe, besides the UK and France, fall into. So this would be an issue if they decided to do that. And there's a history of only one state withdrawing from the NPT, North Korea, and it was heavily punished. The question is would the international community punish a state that withdrew from the NPT? And also, if a country decided that it wanted to develop nuclear weapons, it would need to undergo a series of technical processes. We can talk about Poland, for example. Poland doesn't have a nuclear energy program, doesn't have uranium enrichment, doesn't have plutonium separation capabilities. So it would need to make substantial long-term investments in the civilian nuclear fuel cycle. And I think at this point, were Poland to do it, it would seem to be highly suspect. So the question is how would the international community react? And how might Russia react if it sees countries potentially developing nuclear weapons to be used against it?
So, Nicole, I don't know if you have anything else to add to that. But
I mean, I think you also see, within the NPT regime, it's not just states that would aspire or potentially aspire to acquire nuclear weapons, but there's been a fraying consensus among great powers, particularly the US and Russia, within the non-proliferation regime. And there's also this sentiment, actually, that you see from the global south and from countries, actually like Iran, for example, that the non-proliferation regime has benefited a few countries and a few powers and actually been a detrimental effect to a lot of their own national development or for their own sovereignty. And so there's been pushback existing against the NPT even prior to the war in Ukraine. And you kind of see this tension between the haves and the have-nots when it comes to the NPT regime. But the Russian and the US tensions within this structure, or Russia's broader tensions with France and England as well, the P5, that has really contributed to the souring and lack of progress really on traditional non-proliferation policies. So if you do see U.S. allies seeking a nuclear weapon, the real calculus here is like, does that change the kind of consensus between the great powers that have benefited from exclusively possessing nuclear weapons? And so this is where it actually gets quite interesting. And if you see kind of a recalibration when it comes to both the U.S. and the Russian position there.
Yeah, I was reading one opinion piece earlier today, actually, and the sort of one of their core arguments was that Europe shouldn't bother trying to focus on adjusting or whatever, expanding its own nuclear policies, but really become the flagship for continued emphasis on disarmament. But I feel like that's sort of somehow just not going to happen in the prevailing geopolitical climate we live in now. And also, sort of, they said that if you got the French providing that umbrella instead of the Americans, that would largely make other European nations strategically subjugated to the French instead of the Americans. I don't know if you guys have any thoughts on that, but I just don't see the idea of disarmament talks and efforts really having much wind behind their sails now. Or do you disagree?
There have been a number of organizations and activists that I think have promoted disarmament and believe that the war in Ukraine would lead to a continued emphasis on disarmament because of the scary and highly salient threats made by the Russian government.
Right.
Many of these critics said that when Sweden and Finland joined NATO, that it was a betrayal of their values for joining the nuclear umbrella. And many of these critics had been advocating for the end of NATO nuclear deterrence because they said it adds tension to the continent. And so what's interesting as we see cracks and fractures in the potential US provision of the nuclear umbrella to Europe, we see European governments beginning to freak out. And what that tells me is that the positions of the disarmament activist, noble as they may be, and the positions of European governments are not the same thing. In a world which may be potentially absent of US nuclear deterrence, European governments immediately look for alternative sources of nuclear protection. And there's an interesting dilemma here that I think Nicole pointed to earlier. And she talked about, would France actually provide a nuclear umbrella? Now, the French nuclear arsenal and the British, as we mentioned, exist at the strategic level. They are designed to protect the strategic interest of France and Britain, which is why they are functionally designed for hitting large military targets in Russia and Russian cities, and not designed for tactical battlefield nuclear weapons use. Now, no one doubts that if France were attacked by Russia, that France would use nuclear weapons against Russia. The question about would France protect Lithuania, would France protect Romania, I think is really a question of credibility. And how would that be perceived in Moscow? Would the Russians believe that to be credible? Another interesting point is that French leaders have actually never believed in the concept of extended nuclear deterrence. If you look back to the old papers and statements of Charles de Gaulle, now some scholars will tell you that the French developed nuclear weapons for reasons of prestige. And I think that's in part true. But one of the other reasons why the French developed nuclear weapons is because when the Soviet Union had the capability to hit the United States with ballistic missiles, the French then doubted the credibility of the US extended nuclear deterrence to Europe, didn't believe that it would be true, didn't believe that Washington would be willing to trade, Chicago and Paris, Los Angeles and New York for, Paris and other cities. So the French have never believed in extended nuclear deterrence, and that's why they developed their own nuclear weapons. So it's kind of a little bit of a comical historical development to see France now pushing the theory of extended nuclear deterrence. France is not even a participant, the only member of NATO to not be part of NATO's NPG, the nuclear planning group, because France wants to have complete autonomy in its nuclear decision making, not subject to the will of other NATO states.
Right. I guess to follow up on that, and then I do want to bring in the Russian element because, Nicole, your expertise there is really interesting. But the French seem to test their weaponry, their equipment relatively on a common basis. The British, I think, Trident is in need of a significant overhaul, modernization. And there's also some, I don't know if you can answer this, Stephen, but some arguments that the British don't even have full strategic ability to make use of their nukes because they have to go in touch with Washington. Is that true? Or, how would this work between the two interoperably? And, would we have to see some kind of reorganization in terms of how the sovereign states manage their weapons? Because obviously if they put them in parts of Germany or whatever, that they wouldn't relinquish the actual control. So it wouldn't necessarily work, or am I mistaken?
Nicole, do you want that? Or
you can take a stab at it. I'll add whatever.
Okay. So no worries. So one of the things that I think is important is the Brits have consistently said that their nuclear weapons exist for the defense of NATO. Some have interpreted that to mean that the British nuclear deterrent is not actually independent. So the Brits do have operational control of their nuclear weapons, but the Brits have a nuclear cooperation agreement with the United States that has led to the joint development of systems with the United States. But the Brits still maintain operational control over the weapons. I think the point that's interesting is that the United States, as it has done with its forward deployment of tactical nuclear weapons in Europe, maintains operational control over the weapons. But in the event of a decision by the US president to use nuclear weapons, and then in consultation with NATO's nuclear planning group, those US tactical nuclear gravity bombs in Europe would be delivered on dual-capable aircraft, which would be piloted by pilots from the national governments where those weapons are stationed. So you'd have Turkish pilots and Belgian pilots and Italian pilots delivering US nuclear weapons. And that's believed to contribute to nuclear deterrence because it would be more credible. But the United States maintains custody of the nuclear weapons in Europe, despite the fact that they're on European military bases. The question is what would be the case with France and Britain? France and Britain have, as Nicole mentioned, they have strategic nuclear weapons for their strategic interest. They are based in their national countries or at sea on submarines. And they are, for example, in the French case, not subject to the nuclear planning group, and additionally are not subject to forward deployment in this increase in credibility by being delivered by other pilots from elsewhere. So there's a question in the operational decision-making procedures. How could Britain and France make other countries in Europe feel comfortable with what they're doing, which may have to involve forward deployment or lower yield tactical nuclear weapons? And second, what could they actually do to make this credible to Moscow? If there were low-level Russian incursions, hypothetically, into the Baltic states, and the United States were to threaten the use of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons on the battlefield coming from a European country against Russia, I think this would be seen to be a lot more credible than the French or British threatening the use of weapons which are hundreds of kilotons more powerful than weapons used against Hiroshima and Nagasaki in response to a Russian incursion. So I think there's a credibility issue, one, among the NATO allies, and there's a credibility issue with Russia.
Okay. And I don't know, Nicole, if you want to add anything, but I want to bring in the Russian aspect a bit.
Okay, then go ahead, yeah.
No, okay. Well, what I'd like, are we seeing a return to more Cold War era kind of deterrent strategies? You've mentioned the tactical nuclear element and Putin's, bluffs or rhetoric in the past couple of years, and he did make that policy change. I mean, it doesn't necessarily mean too much in terms of substance, but it was still a notable development, I think, at the end of, around September, October, when there were again a lot of saber rattling. So are we seeing a reversal of this and just back towards sort of, Cold War era kind of rhetoric and deterrence approaches?
I mean, it's quite interesting that, during the Cold War, one of the kind of solutions to the Soviet Union and the Warsaw Pact, conventional forces and also soldiers and kind of ability to have a manpower pretty much was the kind of inception of ideas about nuclear weapons as a form of war fighting. And in that context, in a conventional and potentially escalate to a nuclear war in Europe, but that would be limited in scope. And so there's a lot of, I think, theorization and thinking about that now in this context. And as Stephen alluded to, to ensure credibility, I think perhaps, the French or the British may pursue non-strategic or tactical nuclear weapons to diversify its posture. And that is where you actually come into nuclear weapons as maybe potentially a form of war fighting, which is actually quite concerning, especially considering the way that the Russians have conceptualized this and how the Russians think about the role of non-strategic nuclear weapons. And they're, of course, just the sheer numbers that the Russians possess in terms of non-strategic nuclear weapons and how this kind of plays out in Europe. So there is a return to some of the Cold War era concepts, which is disconcerting.
How vulnerable are the British and the French to Russia's nuclear triad dominance? Because, I mean, the Russians use land-based ICBMs like the Sarmat and Yars, but the British, they are very reliant on those SLBMs. So could you take us through the sort of the differences between the Russians and the Europeans and how the Russians might be able to leverage that in a way? Because a lot of people just focus on the quantity, but there are, I think, delivery systems that are a little bit more important to keep in mind here as well, or it doesn't matter.
I mean, realistically, Russia's main targets, or at least its main planning, has gone into strategic nuclear exchanges with the United States.
Right.
In a lower intensity, perhaps what they call a regional conflict or a regional war, there's obviously NATO targets, military infrastructure, primarily counterforce targets, pretty much. Or war-sustaining industry targets. So that's the way that the Russians kind of have planned, at least what we assume in terms of their planning. I mean, the Russians do express quite a bit of concern about the Trident and also for the British submarine capabilities. But in an all-out nuclear exchange, you would likely see the Russians dominating just because of the numbers game here. And of course, the Russians have road mobile ICBMs. They have, silo-based ICBMs. And they also have the naval and also the air, which makes their kind of triad complete. So they do have a more diverse and also a much more expansive nuclear arsenal in both the United Kingdom and France. And so the numbers actually do somewhat matter in this sense.
Oh, okay.
One of the most shocking developments that I've seen has been in some of the dialogues that I've been in with European colleagues recently. for a long time, there has been interest among European colleagues, of course, in nuclear arms control between the United States and Russia. If there would be, a war between NATO and Russia, Europe is likely to be the battlefield and where a lot of the nuclear weapons would be used. And we have this current problem where the New START treaty, which expires next year, the only, nuclear arms control treaty between the United States and Russia, is currently suspended. And President Trump has said that he would be interested in potentially reducing the U.S. arsenal, possibly up to by half, alongside Russia and China. Now, this is difficult because China has said it will never participate in the trilateral format with the United States and Russia, and the Trump administration has made some cuts to the staffing of nuclear agencies in the United States, which would include some of the officials who would be responsible for verification of nuclear treaties. But the thing which I have found is shocking is that some of my European colleagues who have long been proponents of nuclear arms control between the United States and Russia are now saying they might not think of nuclear arms control between the United States and Russia as a good thing, because it would signal some sort of rapprochement between the United States and Russia and them cozying up, and that even at lower levels, Russia could still threaten Europe. And so the combination of arms control between the United States and Russia at the strategic level, combined with Russia still maintaining large numbers of tactical nuclear arms and a potential U.S. withdrawal or lesser commitment to the continent, I've heard from some colleagues would actually not be seen in a positive light.
Well, I was going to ask a bit about that. Sorry, Nicole, go ahead.
One thing I just would add is, given the performance of Russia's army in the war in Ukraine, one has to wonder how its strategic rocket forces would function, or whether or not the Russian nuclear enterprise suffers from some of the endemic corruption that really kind of was on display in the battlefield in Ukraine and actually hampered Russia's efforts to retake territory. I mean, are there those challenges within its, rocket forces, which are the ones who operate the majority of Russia's nuclear weapons, with the exception of some in the ground forces, which are the Iskander brigade. So are these corruption issues? Do these missiles work? Have they been adequately tested? I mean, the novel weapons that Putin keeps on referencing or referring to have had actually issues in terms of its testing. So there's a lot of other questions that sometimes we forget to talk about or think about, or link even the conventional side of it to the nuclear aspect.
So I just want to say this, and I think it's important, that one thing that we're seeing the media do when talking about Russian nuclear weapons and UK and French nuclear weapons is do what we call, in political science and military affairs, bean counting. And so people often say North Korea has X number of, artillery tubes aimed at Seoul. And if one of those artillery tubes is non-functional or rusted shut, it still gets counted as an artillery tube. And so when targeters in the open source literature look at the reliability of a nuclear weapon, will it actually function? Can it get to where it needs to be? Yeah. They do a conservative estimate at about 90% for US, French, and British nuclear weapons. So they're anticipating fratricide effects, different types of error, different things going off course, essentially an attrition rate of 10%. Right. Now, I've seen people do calculations where they estimate Russian nuclear weapons at 70%, but the belief is, because you're doing this, that it may actually be much less than that. Now, still, in the numbers game, Russia has more than France and the UK, but it's my belief that the US, French, and UK nuclear weapons are more reliable than the Russian nuclear weapons. However, whether there's corruption, whether there's reduced reliability numbers, Russia has such a large nuclear arsenal, it's not a game we want to play thinking about calculations. Will they work or not? We kind of just have to assume that they will